edition of our guest speaker series. This is our 5th season putting this on. So this evening we're welcoming back a return presenter, Joyce here. This is the 3rd time she's presented with us, and I think she was actually one of our first way back 5 years ago. So we're happy to have her back. So this evening she's going to be talking about Belva Lockwood, a local woman of note. There we go. I'll get the words out. But just a quick thank you to GoArt. This program is sponsored in part by them through the DEC grant program. So we got a nice sum of money to help put this on and bring this program to everybody. And thank you all for coming. And Joyce, take it away.
Thank you. A lot of you know already, but I taught school for 40 years, and the last 34 were at Attica Middle School. I started out as a high school social studies teacher, ended up in 5th grade. And after I retired, I was just so used to doing something every minute of my life, I decided I'd start doing presentations. And I love to do research, and so now I've got like 50 of them. And I do a lot on famous women. I do a lot on Civil War. I do a lot on American Revolution. And I just love to research, and I like to talk, and I like to present information to people. And Belva Lockwood is a local person, you might say, because she was born to Lewis and Hannah Bennett, and she was among the first settlers in Niagara County. And so she is from western New York. She was born Belva Ann Bennett in the town of Royalton, and her family were basically farmers, and probably most of you have been to or know where Royalton is. The homestead, unfortunately, is no longer there, but it kind of stands in ruins at the Royalton Ravine Park in Gasport. Her aunt's house, this is the one on the bottom, she spent a lot of time there, and that's in the Griswald role. And in front of that house is a memorial to her and a plaque that gives a brief biography of her life. And it'd be hard to give a brief one because really, she was phenomenal. She did so much. And I think, how many of you have heard of her before you came tonight? Okay, a few, oh, quite a few, okay. Now, sometimes you know, okay, you've heard of her, but you don't know the whole story. It's like a lot of these people, you know, I have one on the person that wrote the Battle Hymn of the Republic. And everybody, okay, she wrote that. But I've got a whole program on all the other things she did. So a lot of people, they do a lot more than just what one little sideline in history is. Belva went to a one-room school, which was not unusual, okay, in that time period, and learning came very easy. She was a great student. When Belva was 14, which is quite normal, her parents decided it was time for her to leave school. Because at that time, they didn't think it was that important for girls to get an education anyway, so time to go out and work. So at the age of 14, the local school board asked her to become a teacher. Gee, we had to go through a little more than that, didn't we, to become a teacher? And so at 14, and that was typical too. If you had a kid and they were smart and they wanted to, they could be a teacher. You didn't have to go through 4 or 5 years of college, and you didn't have to get a master's degree, and you didn't have to take all these classes. You could just say, I want to be a teacher, and you were. But she also discovered something else. The young male teacher was making more than she did, and she didn't think that was too right. Now, I also know my mother graduated from Genesee Normal in 1934, and she started teaching elementary, and she told me that the men that taught high school made more than she did. High school teachers made more than elementary, and this was in 1930s. So she was so outraged at the age of 15, she went before the school board to protest. Now this is a gutsy lady. She was just a kid, but at 15, she would go before the school board and claim, hey, I want more money. Belva believed at that point, well, maybe she needed to get more schooling. Maybe this would help. And in order to she had a lot of dreams, and it wasn't just teaching school. Her father, of course, like many fathers, was very much against the girl getting an education. Education was for the boys, because they were going to have a family and support the family, and you were just going to get married and you didn't need an education. So he was quite typical. At the age of 18, she did what most girls did, got married. And if you do, I do genealogy, and you find out a lot of them didn't wait that long. At 14 or 16, they got married. And that was thought, okay, that was fine. At that time, that was normal. Her parents gave her a Bible. That's what she got for a wedding gift. And her parents were very religious and Christian. And she married a 22-year-old farmer named Uriah McNall. Unfortunately, things did not go too well. He was in the lumber industry. This is just a typical picture of a lumber mill, similar to what they had, okay? But unfortunately, after the birth of her daughter, her husband was really badly injured at the mill, which again happened a lot. And so she had to take over doing just about everything. And he eventually died in 1853. So here she is. She's 22 years old. She's a widow with a little girl. What is she going to do? Well, she decided that she was going to get further education. That's what she originally said. She was going to do it. She enrolled as a student at nearby Gasport Academy. And when I did this, and some of the other research papers and things I did, I found out there were a lot of different academies around Western New York. And that people have really never heard of. They didn't last that long, and then they kind of disappeared. Well, this academy was established at Reynolds Basin in 1837, and the building erected with funds raised by subscription. That's what they did. The first trustee was these people, all leading citizens. Don G. Frazier was principal, and attendance of about 90 pupils. The institution continued about 10 or 20 years when it was given up and the building demolished. So that's why a lot of people don't know it. But Gasport did have an academy for about 10 or 20 years. Genesee Wesleyan Seminary, you may know about it, but not by that name. After finishing the academy, she went back to teaching. And in 1854, she lived with her grandmother and studied at Genesee Wesleyan Seminary in Lima, New York. Now, I've been there. It's not called that now, but it's called Elam. Okay. At the first session, it just kind of goes over. It was established in 1929. The first students came in 1832, and it was incorporated in 1834, one of the first co-ed schools. There were very few. Most of the boys had their academies, and the girls had their finishing schools, which they, were taught literature and art and manners and, good things that they needed to know at that time. Genesee College. She wanted to transfer there. It was all right in Lima. There were two. There was the Wesleyan one, and there was the Genesee College. But they didn't allow females. And that was rather expensive anyway, because the tuition was $8.50 a term, plus 25 cents extra to bring wood to the room. And I know my niece I went to Oswego. She just graduated in Oswego, and her mother showed me what she paid for one semester. Oh my goodness! And every little tiny thing was down. I mean, when I went, there was tuition and board. That was it. Two things. This they list everything, and everything costs money. But at that time, this was quite expensive. Today, the Elam campus in Lima was originally the site of the Genesee Wesleyan Seminary, one of the first co-ed schools. It was founded in 1849. The two institutions shared the same campus until 1870, when Genesee College relocated to Syracuse, and that became Syracuse University. But it originally was in Lima and called Genesee College, which I didn't know that either. And so I thought that was kind of interesting. The seminary continued to occupy the campus until it closed until 1941. Shortly thereafter, the National Youth Administration and New Deal Project, championed by Eleanor Roosevelt, briefly made the campus a location for one of the NYA's experimental resident work centers. The center provided vocational training for underprivileged students, but closed in the summer of 1942. The Methodist Church operated the Genesee Junior College at the site from 47 to 51, and then Elam Bible Institute took it over and built the buildings. And the 2 campus buildings were listed in the National Register. You can see these. I went to a conference one time at this college, and you can tour them. They're really interesting. So they're still there. So she went to college. She graduated from the seminary. And after graduation, she was offered to be the head of the Lockport Union School District. And she met and joined with Susan B. Anthony to get public speaking classes for her girls. This was revolutionary. Public speaking for girls. What do they need to know how to speak? You know, they're supposed to be silent. You know, listen to the husband. And so her ideas were basically very radical at the time. This is a picture of the Union School in Lockport. Lockport boasts one of the first union schools in the whole county and was the home of the birth of that type of system. Until 1848, the village contained no academy, seminary, or educational institution until they got this. So, and I guess the schools didn't sound like they were too great to begin with. So then they got the union schools in Lockport, and she was the head of it. In 1857, her parents went west and took her daughter, which I thought, well, okay. And this gave her a chance to get her career going. And she wanted to study law. Great idea, except it really bothered her that the laws were so unfair to women at that time. Now this is the right before the Civil War, and it didn't change much after that. The salary belonged to the husband. If you did happen to go out and work, and most women didn't, but you went home and you gave your money to your husband. If the husband dies, everything goes to the eldest son. And if he happens to like you, I guess you're all set. But if not, you're in deep water. Her property, everything belonged to her husband. Even if, like, she inherited something, it still belonged to him. And the children belonged to the husband, too. He had the final say on what would happen with the children. Then comes the Civil War. And she organized her girls to sew for the soldiers. This was quite presentable. That was okay. She voiced her opinion against the war. She was against slavery, but not in favor of the method of war to free them. She thought, yes, slavery should end, but must not fight a war over it. In September, she took charge of a female seminary in Gainesville, New York, and introduced higher math, public speaking, and calisthenics. Oh my goodness. I wonder how that went over. The female seminary, and talks about it, it prospered for about 10 years until the adoption of the free school system came into existence. The building has been used for a hotel, residence, and it's still there, I guess. And the largest number of students ever at the female was 150. Now, they said they built it a couple times, they built it, had subscription, and it's 2,000, you could build houses and everything at that time. Every reasonable effort was to be made to secure a thorough practical knowledge in every branch pursued. No student was encouraged to leave the elementary branch, such as reading, spelling, penmanship, and orthography, and pass to higher branches until she can do so with honors to herself in the school. So they had to kind of have different exams as you moved along. Okay, unfortunately the seminary burned down, and so she took a job teaching in Hornellsville, which happens to be where my relatives are from, which I didn't know she taught there. She taught in Hornell. And, but she ran into some problems there over the views on war and girls' education. So I guess they let her go. Didn't say that, but I get the idea. With monies that she saved, okay, she opened her own McNall Seminary in Owego, New York, in 1862 to 1865. So you think about a girl, they were, and all the things that she did by the time she was not that old, she really was revolutionary as far as what she did. In 1865, she decides to move to Washington, D.C. and start up something different. She was an assistant at a young ladies' seminary there. She spent hours in the Library of Congress reading congressional records and joining equal rights groups. So she started being more into women's rights at this time, and reading the Library of Congress. Light reading, of course. She tried to apply for a government job, at the American Council in Belgium. She would assist U.S. citizens visiting Belgium. No one even acknowledged her application. I guess it just kind of went in the trash. And, you know, it's a woman. We don't want a woman, so they didn't even acknowledge her. So, in 1867, she bought a Union League Hall in Washington, D.C., and rented space for meetings, and had room for a school and apartment for her, and Lulu was back with her. Laura was back with her. But, again, she's still considering a new career. Remember she was interested in law? Well, she's still interested in law. It was her time, she said. She wanted to be a lawyer. She wanted to read law as an apprentice, because that's what you did back then, to be a lawyer. You read with someone else and you apprenticed for so many years. The only problem is, no male lawyer was brave enough to have a woman become an apprentice. So, she was, you know, she thought, okay, I can't be an apprentice, I'll learn it on my own. So, she bought a copy of William Blackstone's Commentary on the Law of England. If you can imagine what that probably looked like. She read it on her own. It was a legal Bible of all law students. Every evening after she taught, remember she had a seminary, she read it with no guide, meaning no teacher's guide. There it was, and she was just reading it. And I can imagine it was probably huge and very, very legal. Written. In 1868, she meets Dr. Ezekiel Lockwood at an equal rights meeting. Some men did go, not too many, but some did go. And they got married March 11th, 1868. She doubled her speaking schedule about the right to vote. And of course, luckily, she happened to marry a guy who believed in this, which was unusual at that time too. He was an American Civil War veteran. He was a Baptist minister and practiced dentistry. Now, it always gets me, back in the 1800s, when they talk about a certain person, they list all the things. They have all this list of things they did. You know, I mean, he was a Baptist minister, he was a dentist. You know, they could just do things. They didn't have to have all this education. Like today, we're so like kind of locked into one specific thing. You know, even like when I taught high school, when I wanted to teach elementary, I had to go back and get my elementary degree. You know, you couldn't do it with a high school degree, teaching degree. So everything was very, today, categorized. They had a daughter, Jessie, but unfortunately she died before her second birthday, which was not unusual back then either. Not only did Reverend Lockwood have progressive ideas about women's role in society, he helped raise Belva's daughter, Laura, from her first marriage and supported his wife's desire for legal study, as well as encouraged her to pursue subjects that interested her. Again, this was quite unusual for a husband back then. Lockwood wanted to vote. This was something she really was interested in, and she got involved in women's right to vote. And she helped organize the Washington Universal Franchise Association. One night, she went to hear Susan B. Anthony speak. Women should be allowed to work at any job they wanted to. She thought, wow, here's a lady that speaks my language. This is what I wanted. Belva dreamed about running her own law office. She thought about that years ago. Had to keep giving up her dreams for one reason or another, but she still had it. Another crusade. Congress refused to improve the salaries of women government workers. She started a campaign to push members of Congress to get them higher salaries. She wrote and convinced a Tennessee congressman, Samuel Arnold, to introduce legislation to ensure women who wanted government jobs would be treated fairly. So she did find somebody that would maybe help champion it. I mean, she couldn't do much on her own. In March 1870, there was a proposal introduced to Congress. A bill to do justice to the federal employees of the government. The Arnold bill caused quite an uproar, as you can imagine. It was debated and debated and debated. And then they approved a version of the bill, okay? And it taught her how to talk to members of Congress and persuade them to alter their views. In other words, she learned the art of lobbying, and she did it really well. About 1870, she applied to the Columbia Law School in the District of Columbia. The trustees refused to admit her, fearing she would distract the male students. They didn't want the women and the men in the same room because the men would be distracted by the women sitting there. She and several other women were finally admitted to a new National University Law School, which is now George Washington University Law School. She was told that it was be co-ed. She said, what? Okay, it's going to be co-ed, great. But the women were taken to separate rooms. Men had complained women were inferior and would not sit in class with them. Now this is the 1870s. Most, whoa, is that mine? I didn't. I should have turned that off. That's terrible. I always tell people to turn off their phones. Okay, she stayed and completed the course. She said, hey, I'm going to complete this. But at the end, she was told she had not studied long enough, would not get a diploma or sit on stage at graduation. Oral exams, she had to get to oral exams to be admitted to the bar. She was asked to be given an oral exam. She sat for 2 long days, answering questions. She did very well, but members of the Board Association had decided ahead of time not to admit her. Law friends arranged for her to take another oral exam, and this one was 3 days long. This time they refused to even make a report on her answers. Okay, now here's a lady that's very determined. She's not going to just go home and say, okay, well, I guess, it's useless. Oh no. Mm-mm. So, to earn money, she wrote for the New York City newspaper, Golden Age, and supported Greeley for president, so she campaigned for him. So we get a little into politics. She continued to fight for her diploma. She decided to take more classes and applied to be readmitted. They refused. So every place she turned, there was a roadblock of some kind. So, in 1873, she was not going to just sit quietly by. Without a diploma, she could not gain admittance to the bar. After a year, she wrote a letter to President Ulysses S. Grant, appealing to him as president ex officio of the National University Law School, which is the one she did go to. She asked him for justice, stating she had passed all the courses and deserved to award a diploma. In September of 1873, within a week of having sent the letter, Lockwood received her diploma. God, the president really answered that quickly, too. And was admitted to the D.C. Bar Association. She was 43 years old, the second woman attorney in the capital. When she tried to gain admission to the Maryland Bar, she was denied, because you had to do a different one for each place, So she applied to the Court of Claims to represent veterans and their families, but she was denied that too. So everything she applied for, no. She applied to the U.S. Supreme Court Bar after having practiced for the minimum 3 years that you were supposed to do this, and secured Albert G. Riddle as a sponsor. But her motion was also denied on gender grounds. You are a woman. And basically every roadblock she hit, it wasn't because of her ability, it wasn't how much she knew, it was because she was a woman. Lockwood thus struggled against both social practice and the limited legal standing according to women. Her status in the law differed from that of an unmarried woman, as a wife was considered strictly subordinate to her husband. Even in 1873, many states refused to allow a married woman to individually own or inherit property, nor did she have the right to make contracts or keep money earned unless her husband gave his permission. So, can you imagine that? Hard for us ladies to imagine that, but I mean, this was, 1873. Nonetheless, Lockwood began to build a practice and won some cases. She became known as an advocate for women's issues. She spoke on behalf of an 1872 bill for equal pay. Lockwood also remained active in several women's suffrage groups and testified before Congress in support of legislation to give married women and widows more legal protection. In her early years in Washington, D.C., police court in D and W streets where Belva was working as an attorney. This was where she had her offices in Washington. Lockwood drafted an anti-discrimination bill to have the same access to the bar as male colleagues. She lobbied from 1874 to 1879, so 5 years she lobbied. Finally, that year, Congress passed a law which President Rutherford B. Hayes signed into law that allowed all qualified women attorneys to practice in any federal court. So, you know, she kept plugging away until she could really get something a lot better for women. In 1879, as mentioned, she had previously been denied permission to practice before the Supreme Court. She spent 3 years pushing through legislation to allow women to practice before the Supreme Court. She became the first woman to do so in 1879. She actually presented a case before the Supreme Court. Lockwood was then sworn in as the first woman member of the U.S. Supreme Court bar on March 3rd, 1879. Unfortunately, her husband didn't see this success. Unfortunately, he died 2 years before this, because he really did, and I don't think she could probably have done all she did if she hadn't had the backing of her husband. I think this was very important. He believed in her, and he stood behind her, but he unfortunately didn't see that she actually got some success. In 1880, Lockwood became the first woman lawyer to argue a case before the U.S. Supreme Court, arguing Kaiser versus Stickney, and later the U.S. versus the Cherokee Nation. Lockwood later sponsored Samuel R. Lowry to the Supreme Court bar, making him the fifth black attorney to be admitted, and ultimately the first to argue a case before the court. This shows she ran for president, 1884 and 1888. In fact, my friend Dave here, he brought, this is like a campaign poster.
A banner.
Banner for an election of 1884. And then it shows here who ran, okay? And of course, they did a lot of publicity for this. And if you want to look at that, it'll be there. And so she ran, and there was nothing that women couldn't vote, but I guess there was nothing that said they couldn't run for president. I mean, she looked. There was nothing that said they couldn't do that. They couldn't vote, but she could run. So the first woman, or some people, when I taught, we always mentioned Victoria Woodhull was mentioned, but she also did. So I guess there was a question if she was the first or the second, but anyway, she ran for president as a candidate of the National Equal Rights Party. She ran in 84 and again in 1888. And if you'll notice, that's what my shirt says. And she was nominated for president of the Republic by the National Equal Rights Party August 23rd, 1884 at San Francisco. They had a convention. And so there was an Equal Rights Party back as far as 1884. She polled nearly 4,500 votes. Right? And ran again in 1888. She was the first woman to dare to run for president, even though women, like I said, could not vote. And this tells about her there. They had a lot of political cartoons back then, and they really slammed her. I mean, they really slammed her. And they had all sorts of not too nice cartoons about her. Harper's Weekly printed an 1884 political cartoon of a parade of Belva Lockwood Club, and here's all these men that look dressed up like babies. Election memorabilia, this is just to show you, she did campaign, and she had memorabilia, she had some little ribbons and all that sort of stuff. She representing a third party without a broad base of support. Lockwood did not have a serious chance. There was no way she was going to win. But the fact that she tried, and that she did it. Notably, American women stated she received 4,100. There's a question on how many. Since women could not vote and most newspapers were opposed to her candidacy, it was unusual that she received any votes, because they probably didn't put much in their paper about her, okay? Mainly it was just whatever she campaigned and handed out herself. And believe it or not, she demanded a recount. See, this is not the first time. She demanded a recount back in 1885. She said she petitioned the U.S. Congress to have her votes recounted. She told newspapers and magazines that she had evidence of voter fraud. This is not new, folks. And she asserted that supporters had seen their ballots ripped up and that she had received 1/2 the electoral vote of Oregon and a large vote in Pennsylvania. But the votes in the latter state were not counted, simply dumped into the wastebasket as false votes. So, there was voter fraud, and Belva Lockwood made an attempt anyway to have it changed. In later years, she was a well-respected writer who frequently wrote essays about women's suffrage and the need for legal equality of women. Among the publications in which she appeared in the 1880s and 90s was Cosmopolitan, the American Magazine of Civics, Harper's Weekly, and Olympicon. In addition to being active in the National American Women's Suffrage Association and Equal Rights Party, Lockwood participated in the National Women Press Association, the Organization for Women Journalists, also advocated for equal rights for women. So she did a lot in her life. You know, she just didn't sit on the sideline and say, well, somebody else can do that. She got in right into the middle of it. She believed strongly in working for world peace. She co-edited a journal called The Peacemaker, and she belonged to the Universal Peace Union. She was one of its representatives at the exposition held in Paris in 1889. That lady got around. She was also a delegate to an International Peace Congress in London in 1890. She continued to speak on behalf of peace and disarmament to the year of her death. She was likely disappointed as the United States prepared to enter the war in Europe. In 1909, she received an honorary doctorate. Remember, they wouldn't let her in Genesee College at the time, but now in 1909, from Syracuse University, they gave her a doctorate. Oops. I'm going to be low, I'm plugged in.
It helps if the,
That turned on.
Oh, okay. We didn't turn it on. Didn't think about that. Okay, I wonder, because I plugged in. Okay. F Street home in Washington, D.C., across from the patent office is where she lived, she worked, and she died. So she never had a big, huge mansion or anything like that, or, you know, I don't think she ever really made a lot of money. And she probably put it into the organizations that she believed in. She died in 1917. She had a 43-year career as a lawyer and is buried at the Congressional Cemetery in Washington, D.C. What is really sad, though, is what did she never get to see? In the 1920s, women's right to vote. And that's so sad. I know I have another program on women's suffrage. So many of the original people that even met at Seneca Falls in the 1848 convention there, they never saw it. They never lived to see the fact that, yes, all that work that they put in for, 60 years or something, finally, they got it. But anyway, she died in 1917. Tributes. There's a historic marker put up by Pataki that mentions that she's the first woman to argue before the Supreme Court in 1879, presidential candidate, equal rights parties, and that's in Royalton. And then there's another one that says this, near this spot stood the log cabin birthplace, and it tells about where she was born. And I wouldn't have noticed, they're putting up a lot more markers than they used to have. I've been on the roads and stuff, they'll have a marker. Oh, that wasn't there before. They've really done a lot more on markers. This was erected by the Royalton Historical Society, where she was at the Academy. Syracuse University, like I mentioned, awarded her doctorate. The communities of Belva, West Virginia, Lockwood, California, Lockwood, West Virginia, and the hamlet of Lockwood, New York are all named in her honor. As Lockwood gained renown, mothers started to name their daughters Belva. This is a memorial garden on Griswald Road, and this has two of the plaques that you can go and see. Ships, at least 3 figureheads were carved in her likeness for the ship Martha, Julia Lawrence, and an unnamed ship that had a full-length masthead. One of the figurine heads is displayed in the Museum of Mystic Seaport in Mystic, Connecticut. With raised chin, she gazes straight ahead as if her attention were fixed on the distant horizon. During World War II, a merchant marine ship, the Liberty ship USS Belva Lockwood, was named after her. The National Portrait Gallery in Washington, D.C. has this picture of her when she received her doctorate from Syracuse University. If you've gone to the National Hall of Fame in Seneca Falls, she was inducted in 1983. Now, I haven't been there this year, but I guess they've got a new, they bought this, how many have been to the one there? It's not much bigger than this room practically, it's too small. So what they bought across the river, over the bridge, they bought a knitting mill, and it's big, and I think it's open now. They were doing a lot of it during the pandemic and everything, but I believe it's open. I want to go see it, because they needed so much more room than what they had. Because all they had was this is not a good picture, but each person just had a plaque with their little thing. That was it. That's all they had. So now they've got a lot more room to do some more things. In 1986, she was honored with a postage stamp. Look at that, 17 cents. And
1986.
the quotes. I love some of her quotes. I know we can't abolish prejudice through laws, but we can set up guidelines for our actions by legislation. And she believed in legislation, and she lobbied. And you don't hear her doing a whole lot of protest. More of it was just really doing it through the legal system. I do not believe in sex distinction in literature, law, politics, or trade, or that modesty and virtue are more becoming to women than to men, but wish we had more of it everywhere. The glory of each generation is to make its own precedents. She believed in that firmly. This is a rare thing that I found that shows from the original when she ran for president. These are some of the things that were, stamps and some of the things that were found about her. Two of my favorite sayings. I use these almost in any women's program I do. Do not go where the path may lead. Go instead where there's no path and leave a trail. And I think Belva definitely did that. There was no path for her. There was no way, nobody, spread the way for to go up to be a lawyer and do all that stuff. She did it herself. And the other one I love, well-behaved women rarely make history. That's one of my favorite ones. And all the women that I talk about, and they became famous, she just didn't sit mildly back and say, well, they said I couldn't do it, so I guess I can't. I'll just go home and sew and, take care of the house. The best book about her is this one here. If you ever want to read a good book, this is a really good book. And someone who would have never achieved what she did without Belva paved the way. What is really interesting is who wrote the foreword for this book. I don't know if you can, but got any guess on who it could be?
When was it written?
What's the year? What year was it written?
What year was it written? The book was written in, good question, I gotta look at that. It was written in 2007.
Hillary.
Hillary's like this too.
No, there's Robin.
As soon as you see who it is, you'll know. Now, when I was in Florida, I went to this program, and the woman actually portrayed her. And it was the most phenomenal thing I'd ever seen. And she had all these different things she wore, and different backgrounds and everything, and she gave her life. And she did it for an hour, and it was awesome. But she wrote the excerpt. I'm not going to read the whole excerpt, but she would, and it's most fitting that she would do that, really, of anybody. In 1973, when I first appeared before the United States Supreme Court to present oral argument, nearly a century had elapsed since the court first heard a woman's voice at counsel's lecture. At the start of the 1970s, law remained a dominantly male profession, but the closed-door era had ended. Given the impetus of anti-discrimination legislation, women lawyers were beginning to appear in court, as more than one at a time curiosities. Principal among way pavers in days when women were not wanted at the bar was a brave pioneer named Belva Lockwood. And then she goes on for several pages, and she mentions that Lockwood was not content to rest on her personal achievement. She sought full political and civil rights for women and became a prominent leader in the suffrage movement. She was an activist in international peace movements and became a leading proponent of international arbitration. She goes on, but it's so fitting that she would give this. But I think this was kind of her person that she really looked up to and said, you know, and I personally didn't know that much about her. Did you ever teach about her? No, I didn't either. No, she wasn't even mentioned.
Didn't have time to learn things, right?
You know, and a lot of these women were never mentioned. I taught, Dean taught social studies, I taught social studies. No, they never mentioned. You know, they mentioned women's suffrage, and they mentioned Susan B. Anthony, of course, and a few other people, but they never mentioned about her. And really, I mean, she did so much. And I think she was, you know, the role model for her, and we know all what she did. I mean, her life, I know, she's another one it's amazing what she did. And I don't think, again, people know all the things she was involved in, all she had to do. And she too had to fight the prejudice of being a woman in a basically male profession. So, but let's see, I think that is it. I think as far as I know. Yep. Okay. So I hope you've enjoyed it. Any questions or comments or?
Could you tell us about Laura's life, and does she have descendants since Laura?
Laura?
Laura's life, and did Laura have children? Are there descendants?
I don't know. I never really went in, that's a good question. I never really studied about what happened to her. In most of the books I read, it just never really mentioned what she did. I know she lived with Belva's parents for a while in California, and while she was doing all this, I mentioned she was with her, you know, in the schools and stuff, but then it never really, I don't know, that's a good question, I'll have to look in that, but I don't know what happened to her. But I thought, you know, she was a really remarkable lady. I mean, and the thing is, people don't know about her. That's why I like to do a lot of women, that people, maybe they've heard the name, maybe this was all they, but I know some of you said you'd heard of her, but had any of you had any idea of all she did? No. No. I like to research, so you know, one thing I hate to do is go to a program and go, I knew all that, why did I come? You know, so I like to have stuff that I really research to see, you know, other things that they may have done, besides just the one thing that they know about. Okay, we have these if you'd like to look at them, or any other questions or anything.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming.
All right, well, thank you everybody for coming out tonight. Just a few quick announcements. Tomorrow night is our next trivia night here at the museum. The topic is the Lewis and Clark expedition. So that interests you at all starts at 7 o'clock here tomorrow. And then our next Java with Joe will be the 26th, and Mike Stewart will be presenting on a story about his time in Vietnam. So if you're interested in that, that starts at 9 a.m. that morning. So that's a morning thing, a little different than our normal evening things. But and our next guest speaker will be June 8th. I'm blanking on what day of the week that is, but it'll be at 7 o'clock here.
I think it's Wednesday.
Wednesday, thank you. And we'll be having a speaker from the Erie Canal Museum in Syracuse. He'll be coming in and he'll be talking about the importance of the Erie Canal to the Underground River. So again, be sure to check that out. And the next one after that, I will be presenting actually on June 30th, and I'm doing a presentation that I actually did at the Buffalo History Museum last year called Joseph Ellicott's Ghost, essentially about the remnants of the Holland Land Company and how we still see their impact and things that we can connect to them today. So put those on your calendar and just keep an eye out as we'll be posting more of them. Yes, Mary?
Excuse me, I don't hear very good.
That's okay.
Could you tell me, did you say May 26th, Wednesday? Is it 9 a.m.?
May 26th is a Thursday.
Oh,
Yes, but it is 9 a.m.
9 a.m.
Yes,
Okay, thank you.
no
Well,
problem.
now, this weekend, Lockport's having a big thing on the Erie Canal. They're doing a whole lot of stuff on it, so it's very,
So yeah,
Ever
so we're growing the guest speaker series, so I want to thank you all for coming out, and hopefully we'll see you at some future ones. And please have a cookie and some coffee, because I do not need any more.